Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, Staff Training and Research Institute of Distance Education, STRIDE, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, Distance Education, MADE, First Year. MDE411 Growth and Philosophy of Distance Education. Block 5 Growth and Innovations. Unit 3, Distance Education in the Third World, Critical Analysis on the Promise and Reality. Jeff Arger Editor's Note: Jeff Arger from the Department of External Studies at Australia's University of New England brings critical reflection to bear on what distance education is actually achieving for developing countries. In this abbreviated version of a longer article, he provides a definition of critical reflection and from an analysis of ICDE publications argues that the promise of mass opportunity, national development and high-quality education is not being delivered. He goes on to examine three systems in greater detail: Papua New Guinea, Malaysia and Thailand. It is clear from the literature that distance education promises to assist national development, particularly in the Third World. It started in the late 19th century with correspondence education promising to provide cheap egalitarian mass education of good quality. The 20th century promise of distance education was revived in the 1950s in Latin America, where radio technology had a high profile, in Africa in the 1960s and in Southeast Asia in the 1970s, because Western-style conventional education was increasingly perceived to have failed to impact on third world development. This promise continues on a worldwide basis in the 80s. For this promise to become a reality, however, it is necessary for the rhetoric to reflect action and for theory to relate to practice. Is this in fact the case in the Third World? It is argued below that by applying a critical analysis to the promise and reality, and the theory of distance education as manifest in the International Council of Distance Education, ICDE, literature since 1985, and also through a critical analysis of the theory and practice of distance education in three developing countries that the author has worked in during this period, the answer is a qualified no. A critical analysis of the literature in the ICDE Bulletin from 1985 and the papers of the 14th ICDE World Conference in August 1988 reveals that distance education promises to assist third world development. Assisted by modern technology, it is a vehicle for large-scale quality education. This education promises to bring about social equality in a cost-effective manner. Further analysis of the same body of literature suggests that there is a wide difference between this promise and the reality. A difference is also seen between theory and practice in such diverse nations as Papua New Guinea, Thailand and Malaysia, where the author has worked during the last 4 years. This work was in such diverse distance educational institutions as the Extension Studies Department of the University of Papua New Guinea, Sukhothai Thammathirat Open University in Thailand and DISTED in Malaysia. The promise and the theory in all cases tend to be the same, but the reality and practice in each is variably different. Methodology: the author has deliberately chosen to analyze ICDE literature critically because, as Evans and Nation 2 IU, as the name suggests, the ICDE is a worldwide organization and it has offered an excellent basis for the exchange of ideas in the field. It has fostered the dissemination of knowledge based upon practice, the fruits of research, and discussion of concepts and theories. Its thrice-yearly bulletin and its periodic world conferences play a vital role in this regard. The ICDE has provided an international forum in which distance educators, who may feel marginalized in the local or national scene, can remind themselves that they are part of an educational endeavor that has worldwide significance. The analysis in the first section has been restricted to the period since 1985 to avoid the easy criticism that any conclusions are based on out-of-date evidence. Likewise, to avoid the potential reaction to a critical analysis of the literature that the author is a researcher without first-hand experience, in the second section the author is critically reflective about the practice of distance education in the third world countries he has worked in recently. The author's long experience in distance education in Papua New Guinea in the 70s and in Saudi Arabia in the 60s will no doubt influence this reflection, but it is only the more recent experience since 1985 which will be the subject of the critical reflection in this article. Inevitably, such reflection is controversial. Harris, 4, adopts such an approach in his book, Openness and Closure in Distance Education. Hence, it is necessary to state briefly what the present author means by critical analysis and reflection. The author fully agrees with the comments made by Evans and Nations that critical reflection is the process through which human beings use their analytical powers to assess the elements of their lives against their explanatory frameworks, theories, and judge practice against theory. Critical reflection is a precursor to change. Critical analysis is achieved by applying this approach to the work of others. It needs to be stressed that this author believes strongly that the most important element of critical reflection is that the persons involved believe in the fundamental equality of the participants. Critical reflection and analysis has its roots in critical theory as expounded by Evans and Nation. Distance education has come of age and it can, and perhaps needs, to bear critique of this nature. The promise of the rhetoric. An analysis of the ICDE bulletins between 1985 and 1988 and the ICDE 14th World Conference papers suggests that a great attraction of distance education is that it promises in a general sense to assist national development. Distance education promises to meet the needs of the national economy. Daniel, Fox, Shah, Gitu, notes that the School of Distance Studies in Kenya used distance education because it promised to foster a sense of nationhood and promote national unity. Such promise is often interwoven with the use of educational technology to reach the masses, as Shah explains. He sees distance education television reaching out to the masses in the dark ghettos of illiteracy, ignorance, disease, poverty, and exploitation. Others express similar sentiments, albeit more moderately. See, for example, Singh. It is noticeable that there is little critique of or reflection on the role of formal education in national development. There is little acknowledgement that formal education, particularly at the tertiary level, may not assist development that is relevant to the majority of the people in the Third World. Nor is there any exposition of the role that education can play in development which is demand-driven, vocationally oriented, and therefore relevant to the needs of that particular society. Distance education's promise, as reflected by ICDE literature, is largely at the tertiary level and within a modernization paradigm of development. Quantity. The promise is also expressed in more specific terms. Much of the attraction of distance education's promise to aid mass education is that it can be applied not only to universal primary education and adult literacy campaigns, but to teacher upgrading. Daniel. This application promises an exponential impact on increasing educational opportunities because upgrading teachers' education levels increases students' education levels dramatically. Furthermore, distance education does not incur high opportunity costs because the teachers remain in the workforce. This also has the added advantage of allowing educational technology to be used easily because it can be directed into schools. In Armengol's words, distance education promises the phenomena of accelerated massification. Linked with this is the promise that distance education can democratize education. Quality. Associated with the above promises is ICDE itself. The growth of professional bodies such as ICDE is an indication that distance education aspires to offer quality education. Through its world conferences and thrice-yearly bulletins, ICDE helps to maintain a high quality of distance education teaching methods and material as well as an understanding of the need for systematic management. It is worthy of note that the high-profile new Indira Gandhi National Open University has a special emphasis on the quality of its material, and its motto is, "Nothing but the best." Indeed, the use of distance education to achieve high standards promises to have a spin-off impact by improving conventional education. Daniel. Cost effectiveness. Underpinning the promise above is the understandably great attraction in the Third World that distance education compared to conventional education is cost-effective. It is seen to have low recurrent costs with the potential to go even lower by the judicious use of educational technology. Shah. Linked with this attraction is the further promise that distance education can be cheaper to implement because it will attract foreign aid funding. Donor agencies such as UNESCO, USAID and the World Bank were visibly present at the 14th ICDE conference. This conference hosted a high-profile meeting between ICDE and UNESCO to discuss a closer relationship which would be, in the words of the ICDE president, particularly useful for developing countries. Suet. Related to this promise is the specific promise of the newly established Commonwealth of Learning, which in the words of a former ICDE president, will operate at the wholesale level helping countries with their development priorities rather than at the retail level of dealing with individuals itself. Daniel. The promise. The promise of distance education as expressed between 1985 to 1988 continues to be its ability to influence national development by offering mass, quality and cost-effective education which could affect social change. A great and attractive promise indeed. Such rhetoric, however, evokes questions such as, is this promise valid? Is it based on empirical evidence? Arja, 19. To answer these questions it is necessary to analyze critically the same body. The reality of the action. National development. It is worth starting with Gittu's comment that it has become increasingly clear that a high ratio of economic development in a country cannot be guaranteed by skilled manpower. Yet this is a central premise of distance education's promise to influence national development. The difficulties of study in the distance education mode for third world students also must not be ignored. The spatial gap and time lag between teacher and student, as well as the isolation of students from their peers, observed by Gittu, can in some third world countries be enormous because of transportation and communications difficulties. Such communications difficulties can also increase the perennial problem of teaching material not being as painstakingly prepared as it should be. Contact between student and the institution in the third world is often extremely difficult. It is not surprising then that Daniel notes that in Africa there is a great gap between need and supply, and questions distance education's promise of assisting national development. It is also worth asking whether distance education is contributing to national development when it positively discriminates in favor of one group against another. Quantity. These are important considerations because the promised ability of distance education to produce large quantities of educational manpower is dependent on certain prerequisites. These were noted in the 60s, Edstrom, as being good mass communication systems, a good home environment, language fluency, skilled course writers, printing capabilities and recognition of distance learning as legitimate. The above comments throw doubt on the ready availability of some of these. Keynes throws doubt on others when he notes the lack of printing capacity, that printing machines cannot be maintained and indeed, that paper can be too expensive. Further, he points out that distance education techniques are not diversified. These factors also affect the quality of the teaching material. Both quality and quantity are also affected by the third world operating conditions. Mullick perhaps most succinctly puts it when he notes distance institutions have neither the infrastructure nor trained personnel for using word processing, radio, television, audio tapes, microcomputers, satellites, audio teleconferencing nor telephone computer-based education. This perhaps explains criticisms that radio and television are used to a very limited extent. Gillard and Williams, for example, believe that only 5% of students use the well-touted USP satellite, yet the university with US assistance placed a lot of stress on the satellite as a potential learning mode. These comments cannot be dismissed as atypical. They may not all appear in all third world countries, but they are characteristic of the third world, Daniel, and are of the magnitude that they need to be taken seriously. The promise that distance education can democratize education is also questioned when the rhetoric is subjected to a critical analysis. In parts of Africa, the ratio of men to women in the national correspondence schools is 6:1, Muro. Here it may be timely to make the point that Africa is not being selected out. Nor is it a case that distance education is less effective there than in other parts of the third world. Indeed, it may well be the opposite, and the frequency of Africa in this critique may be because they are more critically reflective about their practice than others in the third world. The point is that distance education does not seem to be meeting women's expectations, nor is it equalizing opportunities in many third world nations. Mullick. Quality. One promise expressed in the rhetoric is that distance education could offer quality education. Yet a critical analysis reveals that distance education assumes that in order to be successful, certain student predispositions such as a fairly high level of reading ability, high motivation to read and capacity to organize independent study projects must be present. Yet it is known that many students lack a proper development of these characteristics. So if the basic premise of the promise of quality distance education is questionable, does it produce quality education in spite of this? Unfortunately, the answer also appears to be under some doubt. Problems still continue to be expressed about the quality of the print material. Muro, McCormick 3. Caution must be urged regarding dropout and wastage figures, particularly as some high-profile third-world universities do not withdraw non-active students. Indeed, comparing student retention figures in the third world is extremely difficult as there are no standards. Nevertheless, figures such as 15 to 25% dropout rates give rise to questions about the quality of distance education. Attrition rates in excess of 40% per semester make a mockery of distance education being cost-effective. Cost effectiveness. In terms of the general cost effectiveness of distance education, Rumble's words are worth repeating, for it is clear that many third world countries have financial problems. Rumble writes, "It is said, particularly by distance educators, that distance education is cheaper than traditional forms of education. Cost comparisons between distance and traditional educational systems are often difficult to make because the systems may have different objectives or teach different subjects, or the same subjects in very different ways. The previous educational qualifications of the students entering the system may be different, and this may affect their success in producing graduates, and the quality of the teaching may be different. This is different from the promise of distance education being cheaper." Rumble has consulted and written widely on the planning, management and costs of distance education, and he is saying it is difficult to compare these costs with costs of conventional education. The financing of distance education is often linked to foreign aid. At the 1988 ICDE conference, Fox commented perceptively, "I have attended a number of conferences including, I regret to say, those organized by ICDE, where delegates from well-to-do organizations in well-to-do countries deliver to their less well-off colleagues gratuitous advice on how to solve their educational problems, especially those of access by students, by the use of expensive and sophisticated technologies which rely upon expensive and sophisticated technology infrastructures. In particular those associated with telecommunications. The situation is more complex than that because often our colleagues in less well-off countries are asking for advice and assistance. How we, and ICDE, respond is another matter. Nevertheless, this raises a very important question which would benefit from critical reflection on both sides of the equation. Let me conclude this section by critically commenting on the role the Commonwealth of Learning could play in fulfilling the promise that distance education has for the third world. In this reflection I owe much to others, particularly John Oathwork, and I fully acknowledge that contribution. It would be a contradiction of the promise of distance education if the Commonwealth of Learning became merely a vehicle for delivering conventional university education to an elite body of students. The promise will not be achieved if the Commonwealth network reinforces outdated and outmoded conventional education structures rather than establishing one able to serve regional needs and diverse cultures. Indeed, it would be a negation of the promise of distance education to aid third world development if the motivation for the institutions being located in Vancouver were no more than the provision of jobs, with private sector spin-offs, for that city. It is also worth emphasizing that donor agencies do not give assistance without conditions, nor will the private sector support educational objectives different from its own. It would be a travesty if the Commonwealth of Learning gave in to the financial and government pressures of the dominant partners and was diverted from providing the third world with mass-quality education cost effectively through distance education. Critics would then see the Commonwealth of Learning as epitomizing everything bad about aid. The reality. A critical analysis of the 14 ICDE conference and thrice-yearly bulletins suggests that it is highly questionable whether national development is being significantly influenced by distance education. Such an analysis further suggests that distance education is not achieving the goal of improving educational access and equity that it promises either in terms of quality or quantity. Reflection of theory and practice in 3 countries. It is now necessary to reflect on the theory and practice of distance education in 3 very diverse third world countries. They are countries where the author has been involved since 1985 in the practice of distance education. An analysis of the literature of the institutions included should determine the theoretical promise of the rhetoric. Critical reflection on the practice of distance education and the role that critical reflection plays in the process of distance education should establish the degree of separation between the theory and practice of distance education in each particular situation. It should be emphasized here that critical reflection on practice can be personal and that my reflection is exactly that. The following is not a definitive critique of distance education in the countries concerned. Nor must it be seen as that. It is given to demonstrate that critical reflection on practice can assist future changes in distance education in third world countries. Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea has 2 major institutions offering distance education, the College of External Studies, COES, which offers secondary-level courses in the Department of Extension Studies at the University of Papua New Guinea, UPNG. The theory of what UPNG distance education practice should be is best summed up as follows. Reach the greatest number of people possible throughout the nation, and give greater meaning to the principle of equal opportunity for people who have not had the chance for full-time studies, especially those doing important work in remote areas. Improve educational standards of professionals without serious loss in work time. Give reality to the principle of linking education with work, such. Students are better placed than many full-time students in integrating the two worlds of work and study. Their learning is greatly assisted and study is made more relevant. Give highly motivated workers a chance to acquire more knowledge and skills so that they can attain those positions in which the acquired knowledge and skills can be applied in the service of the nation, and cost less per student. The high cost of good quality communication is more than offset by the savings on scholarships, capital cost, and the fact that the student continues to work and is productive. Kelly. Again, the great promise of distance education emerges in the rhetoric. In contrast, the promise of the College of External Studies is to provide a continuing system of education alternative to that of the formal school system for those who, for one reason or another, have been unable to pursue the latter. Kelly. For both of these institutions to fulfill the promise in an island nation of 3 million people, cooperation is essential. In practice, in Papua New Guinea, the COES has had little impact on the provision of secondary education in the country, contributing only 0.7% of the age group's involvement in the sector. Kelly. Plans to offer grades 11 and 12 have not been realized because of financial and physical constraints. So, SOES is not fulfilling the promise of quantity. With regard to quality, the courses are print-based with very little audio material. The print quality is restricted by limited resources and low numbers of students. There is little spin-off to other courses, indeed they are rigidly based upon school curriculum material. Further, there is no evidence that the courses are cost-effective. Similarly, in UPNG the promise of mass education is not realized, with only 420 students enrolled in the pre-degree matriculation studies programs in 1987 and fewer than 200 in the first-year degree arts foundation year. Again, limited financial support outside and within UPNG prevents eligible students from being accepted. Moreover, matriculation is offered only through provincial distance education centers. Unfortunately, the number of centers is determined by the willingness of the provincial government to support the center. This is often dependent on their wealth and priorities, and to date there are only 5 centers in 19 provinces. The quality of the teaching material is affected by a series of factors. Because of low numbers, media other than print are not seen as viable. The quality of print material is influenced by the rapid turnover of expatriate staff. Such academic staff often do not have sufficient time to gain expertise in writing distance education courses. Even good quality material is rejected by new staff who wishes to teach their own course. Not surprisingly, Kelly, one of the few long-time distance educators at UPNG, noted that external numbers were so low at UPNG that it operates like a handicraft industry rather than a mass production device. The reality of distance education in PNG is that cooperation between the two institutions, neither of which is fulfilling its promises, is poor. This is well illustrated by the lack of cooperation over study centers, although it is acknowledged that their function and funding base is different. Moreover, there is little flow of information between the two institutions, although there was joint attendance at a UNESCO workshop in 1986 where such shortcomings were discussed. There is no dialogue, and no critical reflection on the gap between promise and reality in PNG distance education. Malaysia. Distance education in Malaysia, a multiracial nation with large Malay, Chinese and Indian ethnic groups, is dominated by University Saints Malaysia, USM, because of a government directive excluding the other 5 universities from distance education. The aims of distance education are to help adults who had earlier missed the opportunity for obtaining a higher education, and thus qualify for a degree. To narrow the gap of educational opportunities amongst the various ethnic groups in the country. To take education to economically deprived and geographically isolated areas, and to increase the nation's needs for high-level manpower. to improve the performance of those already in employment by updating their knowledge and skills. USM Publicity Brochure. Another distance education organization in Malaysia called DISTED is also worthy of mention. In theory, DISTED is to promote education by providing selected basic and advanced degree and diploma programs based on self-instructional techniques, secured through legal linkages with established and accredited institutions, balancing course, program variety with national and individual needs, maintaining regional centers or units which will, and liaising between the host institutions and students who seek to complete their programs through study abroad. DIST Publicity Brochure, facilitate the organizing of small group discussions, workshops, seminars and/or laboratories. B. Provide greater educational support and access to services offered by DISTED. And C. Create rapport between students and staff of DIST. The aim is to cater to the needs of many students who for a number of reasons cannot pursue university education locally or abroad. To achieve this, DISTED has established formal links with a network of accredited universities overseas which have a reputation for delivering respectable distance education programs. DISTED then serves as a link organization between institution and student. Although University Sains Malaysia had a cautious beginning, it now has in excess of 5,000 off-campus students. The reality is that only 15 to 20% of Malaysia University demand is provided for. In Malaysia itself, $1.2 billion are spent on overseas education, Dhanrajan. A critic might argue that overseas education is being used for social control. Whatever could be the reason, distance education at USM is clearly not fulfilling its promise of mass education. Indeed, the USM off-campus system is further restricted by its access and equity policies. The students are primarily urban, 65%, with the rural ones being mainly teachers temporarily living there, Dhanrajan et al. The system has a 3-week-long, compulsory residential school. Students must spend their last year on campus. USM imposes the same academic entry standard as in the full-time courses, which are restricted to the top 20% of eligible students. Candidates from the public service must be tenured, and there are restrictions on who can and cannot be tenured. In this manner, access is restricted to many in public service employment, Dhanrajan. Whilst there may be some doubts as to whether USM in practice is fulfilling the promise of distance education in providing mass education, it is certainly helping to raise the standard of teacher education and educational level of government employees, which may have an exponential effect on educational provision. Moreover, the quality of the printed teaching material is high. It also has the spin-off of producing teaching material in the new national language of Malay Bahasa. This is particularly valuable in the science area, and all other Malaysian universities use this material. The recent use of technology to establish a teleconferencing network which includes Western Malaysia is impressive and in some ways counters the previously limited use of audio and video. Cost considerations for not using these media were based partly on high production costs but also on the experimental nature of USM designated off-campus education, which resulted in a restricted internal financial allocation. Moreover, radio broadcast programs, even of a reasonable standard, have low credibility with the students because of the general unreliability of the programs going on air on schedule. The key issue for reflection, however, in terms of access and equity is whether, given the discrimination in favor of Malays, distance education can ever fulfill its promise of mass, cost-effective education in Malaysia. In some ways, an answer has been given by the establishment of DIST. This private college with English as a teaching language is heavily subscribed to by the Chinese and Indian race students. In some ways, it is a reflection on USM's success in demonstrating that quality distance education is possible. DIST's quality of teaching material is brought in from overseas and the quantity is restricted only by the ability to pay fees. This system may raise the question of curriculum relevance, and the author's personal experience as an Australian tutoring a group of Chinese and Indian students using material written by Canadians on 17th century English history certainly led to some critical reflection on that issue. Overall, the experience of distance education in Malaysia suggests that until this is a period of national critical reflection on distance education policies. Institutions will continue to follow different directions and thus fail to fulfill the overall theoretical promise of distance education. Thailand. Sukhothai Thammathirat Open University, STOU, is the major distance education university in Thailand, a nation of approximately 52 million. Established in 1978, it has become an exemplary third world distance education institution. As an open university, Sukhothai Thammathirat Open University subscribes to the principle of lifelong education. Aims to improve the quality of life of the population, seeks to upgrade the educational and professional qualifications of working people, and strives to expand educational opportunities at the tertiary level for those who have completed secondary education and also for the general public. To achieve these aims, the university has devised a distance teaching, learning system which employs such educational media as correspondence materials, radio and television programs, and other methods which enable students to study independently without having to enter a conventional classroom. Within the general framework of these goals, the university has set itself the following objectives: to provide and promote academic and professional education to enable people to upgrade their educational qualifications in response to individual and social needs, to promote research for application in national development, to provide educational services to society through the dissemination of knowledge, thereby promoting personal development and professional competence, and to promote national art and culture and encourage an awareness of ethical principles on the part of the general public to strengthen its sense of national identity. Store publicity brochure. In practice, STOU has done much to provide mass education in Thailand. With figures like 82,000 in its first intake, 150,000 in 1987 and with 200,000 in 1988, and a cumulative total of 500,000, with 85% from rural areas, it is well on the way to fulfilling the promise of quantity. STOU believes that such an increase in graduates will not cause economic dislocation because the graduates are already employed and therefore the education is relevant. STOU has also established a worthy reputation of quality print teaching material. Each course has a prescribed number of radio and a lesser number of television programs. The reality here is somewhat more complex. The prescription thus led to airtime scheduling. Perhaps more seriously, the effort of producing the 150 radio and 21 television programs each week has led to a loss of quality in some cases. Some of those I watched were simply talking heads with little pedagogical. In a wider sense, STOU attrition rates, which seem to increase from 15% to 40% for 2 to 4 year courses, are cause for reflection. Such figures undercut quantity, quality and cost effectiveness as well as causing pedagogic concern. These rates cannot be blamed on unrealistically high academic standards. Because 60% of the final mark is attained in the residential professional session before the exam, and 40% is attained by a multiple choice examination. There are no semester assignments. These comments must not be seen as being unduly critical of STOU because the institution itself has been critically reflective on these issues. They have, and are, questioning the wisdom and difficulties of prescribing a number of media segments. They acknowledge that they had initially pursued access as a major concern, but that now, after a period of critical reflection, and at STOU these are long sessions with the staff, STOU recognizes that its highest priority is to increase interaction between staff and students, which will help motivation and cut down attrition. The question of how relevant such education is to national development is not being reflected upon yet. The theory and practice. Critical reflection reveals that the gap between theory and practice varies from country to country. Perhaps it is at its widest in Papua New Guinea and Malaysia, although a new practice in Malaysia, DISTED, may change that situation. There is little critical reflection on the practice of distance education in either of these countries. In Thailand, there is evidence that the gap between theory and practice, after being wide, is closing as critical reflection is being adopted as part of the practice of distance education. It is noticeable that in the countries which have critical reflection in their distance education practices, the gap between theory and practice is the least. The gap between promise and reality, and theory and practice seems to be determined partly by the level of the rhetoric used in expressing the promise and partly by the role that critical reflection plays in the process of distance education. The need for critical analysis and reflection. What emerges from a critical review of the recent ICDE literature and a critical reflection on the practice of distance education in some of the third world countries that the author has worked in recently is less the suggestion that distance education's promise of being able to provide a quality, cost-effective education for the masses of the third world is not a reality. It is argued that the promise will not become a reality because the TORIC frequently does not affect action nor do theory and practice become one. For this to happen, distance educators must become more critically aware in their analysis and reflection. The analysis and reflection above suggests that when such an approach is applied as an ongoing process to distance education in the third world, the promise moves nearer to reality. The rhetoric is closer to action whilst theory and practice begin to merge. It now only remains for distance educators to analyze and reflect on the practice in the third world and change it accordingly. Thank you.